The gas business, a source of conflict since the Cold War. That's because the gas Europe so desperately needed came from Russia, a partnership that creates major political dependency.
So this was all seen as part of an overall Soviet strategy to weaken the West and to break up NATO.
Fears that were by no means unfounded.
Using oil and gas dependencies as a political weapon was common practice in the Warsaw Pact.
Meanwhile, a young Putin began his extraordinary career.
As a case officer, you have to be able to manipulate people.
There is no such a thing as former KGB guy.
Vladimir Putin became one of the world's most powerful leaders and made the gas business a top priority. The Russian president recognized the power of his nation's greatest treasure.
He said, "We do have more oil and gas than anyone else, and people should remember that."
The Europeans know that there's no truly reliable alternative to Russia as an energy partner.
German governments in particular continued their reliance on Russian blue gold. It was clear who had the upper hand in this arrangement.
Which fields can we access? What pipelines are available? If you don't have any, and that's the case here, we'll have to look for ways to be compensated.
Gazprom set the prices and the conditions. The challengers were punished.
If someone's turning off the gas tap in the 21st century, you could definitely call it an act of war.
Despite saber-rattling and cutting its supplies to Eastern Europe, Russia's aggressive foreign policy was tolerated. And that's not all.
Right? The idea that you would still build up this dependence on Russian energy was thought of as crazy.
Nord Stream will help to ensure that Europe continues to have a secure supply of gas in the future.
Russia remained the guarantor of gas industry stability in Western Europe, while the political fallout was ignored.
Gazprom is part of the Russian army. It's one of their weapons.
Western Siberia, Russia. Here, the region's indigenous people uphold their 1,000-year-old traditions. The Nients are reindeer herders. For decades, Mako Sereveto's retinue has been following the same route through the tundra up to the northern Kara Sea. But then Gazprom opened a gas field across the herders' path.
The route we use to take the animals through the tundra is becoming more and more difficult. Railway lines, pipes and roads, it's a huge problem.
Pristine natural surroundings, now consigned to history. After the river, the group must navigate the hard concrete roads around the Bovanyankovo gas fields. The provisional solution on this particular day, Gazprom workers roll material out over the road. This protects the wooden runners on the Nients sleds.
Hello.
Hello, I'm head of the group.
Pleased to meet you. And what do you think? It wasn't that easy, was it?
Some of the animals didn't want to cross at first. Just like a red carpet.
A cooperation driven by necessity. The Nients and their reindeer can cross the Bovanyankovo field for now, but for how much longer? No one here knows. Gazprom employees on site are well aware of the conflicting interests.
Humans came here and destroyed the unity and harmony of nature. On the other hand, they've opened up new areas. They're extracting gas from nature's resources, and that also brings good things. It feeds our families and creates many, many jobs.
In the year 2019, Gazprom employed 1,200 staff at this site alone. Metalworker Sergei Pavetkin came here for the first time 10 years ago.
I wanted to be there, where the gas comes from, to be at the source and be involved in the process. The first time I was here, the gas wasn't flowing yet. but I was overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of pipes and metal constructions. I was immediately fascinated.
Gazprom eventually began production here in 2012. It's a high-security zone, a kind of Russian gold reserve.
Gas and oil are like drugs. We're addicted. Take them away and what then? Withdrawal symptoms. We can't manage without. Take them away and what's left of our economy? Collapse.
But it wasn't just the Russians themselves who needed a steady supply of blue gold. Europe also relies on gas from Russia, a dependency that Gazprom has been exploiting for decades, furthering Russian President Putin's political power. Spring 2006. Right after Gazprom cut the gas supply to Ukraine as a response to a dispute and price increase. The effects were felt in other European countries. A boon to Gazprom's plans to reroute gas supplies around traditional transit nations, Nord Stream.
The new head of the shareholder committee, Mr. Schröder.
You'll be aware that we have a growing demand for gas in Western Europe and declining self-sufficiency within the region itself. And that's why it's extremely important to build this pipeline to reasonably satisfy the demand that exists and will continue to exist.
In early discussions, Russians were not connecting Nord Stream 1, who was removing transit flow from Ukraine into different route. They were saying it's new gas, but they were lying to everybody about what their real intent was.
While the German ex-chancellor pursued his lobbying activities, a key pipeline supplying gas to Georgia was blown up in the depths of winter. The Georgian government had previously refused to sell its own pipelines to Russia. The Georgians suspected a conspiracy and felt like they were being blackmailed.
I think the world should wake up to this threat, because yesterday it was Ukraine, today it's much worse in Georgia, tomorrow it can be any other European country that is dependent of this irresponsible and unpredictable supplier.
Gazprom's counter-campaign was already in full swing.
We've been assured by Mr. Miller that there won't be any problems with supplies to Germany in the future. There haven't been any problems with the German supply either.
A short time later, Alexei Miller struck a very different tone with EU ambassadors in Moscow. Money alone wasn't enough, he said. The EU should stop obstructing his company's expansion.
The head of Gazprom said, get over your hostility to Russia or you won't get any gas. They thought they were in an imperial position when it came to natural gas.
In 2005, they took us all to Western Siberia. And then we had the dinner with President Putin. I asked him, is Russia an energy superpower? And so he looked at me and he said, oh, I think you know, energy superpower is an old-fashioned Cold War term. But, he said, we do have more oil and gas than anyone else, and people should remember that.
The Germans did. In 2006, the Chancellor and the head of BASF traveled to Siberia to secure access to a new gas field.
Even back then, ideas were already circulating about building pipelines to the east. There's a need for gas there in China. Another reason why it was geopolitically important for us to secure these gas reserves for ourselves in Europe.
The pipeline project continued, without consulting Eastern European nations. The unilateral approach unsettled Radek Sikorski, who was Polish defense minister at the time.
There's a long history of very ominous direct relationships between Germany and Russia. We count among those the partitions of Poland, and then of course the Hitler-Stalin Pact. When Germany and Russia fix something together over our heads, we don't like it. We feel threatened by it.
The Europeans know that there's no truly reliable alternative to Russia as an energy partner. But Europe should not pretend that the Russians had to be grateful for being allowed to supply oil and gas to Europe. On the contrary, the Europeans should make allowances for the pride of the Russian people, the vulnerability of the Russian soul, and the special features of the country's history.
Putin's power depended on the efficient exploitation of Russian energy reserves.
You could see Russian production decline very rapidly with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It came back very strongly in the 2000s, where Russian production recovered, oil prices went up, and Vladimir Putin rode into a stronger and stronger position on the back of rising oil prices.
Keen to hone its international image, the company hosted a British film crew in 2006.
Gas from the likes of the Urengoy field has made this company wildly wealthy, and they let us have a rare glimpse inside the company's nerve centre.
The TV team was even permitted to film in the control room. The managers oozed with self-confidence.
The next benchmark will be 1 trillion.
Biggest company in the world?
Yes.
The British reporter was shown around the entire Gazprom headquarters, but this didn't look like a company with $1 trillion in turnover. Equally modest, the staff infirmary and the small in-house TV studio. 13 years later, we get the same tour. It's a completely different picture. Since 2006, Gazprom has earned more than 200 billion euros from its gas business with Germany alone. Sochi, a city on the Black Sea and host of the Winter Olympics in 2014, sponsored by Gazprom, among others. We're taken around the Olympic Stadium by a member of staff. In St. Petersburg, too, Gazprom maintains a towering presence. When we visited, the offices were still a work in progress. Presented as the company's new HQ, it's the tallest building in Europe. But in the year 2021, after years in the planning, the Lakta Center was still empty, like a movie set. Millions for a hollow symbol of power.
Russia seemed to be a struggling country economically. But then, you know, the big boon for Putin was that energy prices then were rising so fast. And that, I think, emboldened him to do a lot of things that he wouldn't have done otherwise.
Putin's global agenda became more ambitious and aggressive. Since he took office, tens of thousands of people have died in Chechnya, a former Soviet republic that sought independence from Moscow. One courageous journalist dared to criticize Putin for the brutal war.
The situation is ongoing. Human rights are being completely disregarded.
Following 2 attempts to poison the journalist, she was shot dead on the 7th of October 2006 in the elevator of her apartment block in Moscow. It was Putin's 54th birthday. A short time later, ex-FSB agent Alexander Litvinenko publicly exposed the president.
Здесь прозвучал прямой вопрос: кто убил Аню?
Somebody has asked you directly, who is guilty of Anna's death? Who has killed her?
Я даю прямой ответ. Аню убил господин Путин, президент Российской Федерации.
And I can directly answer you. It is Mr. Putin, the president of the Russian Federation, who's killed her.
3 days after the murder, Vladimir Putin visited Angela Merkel in Germany. In a TV interview that evening, Putin praised Merkel's ability to listen well. A few days later, Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with a radioactive substance in Britain. After weeks of suffering, he died. While in Dresden, Vladimir Putin also presented Gazprom as the new sponsor of Schalke 04. the company promised to invest more than 200 million euros in the Bundesliga soccer club.
Gazprom needed to essentially charm its way into the hearts of German football fans so that it legitimized what it was doing, so it would be just seen as a legitimate member of the ecosystem, so that people wouldn't ask questions and they wouldn't feel as though there was something strange or insidious about all of this.
Before long, Gazprom, the Bundesliga, and the Champions League became inseparable bedfellows.
Sport is very important to people. People fall in love with sport, they feel very passionately about it. And so because of that, people had almost this unquestioning relationship, not just with Gazprom, but by implication with the Kremlin. That proxy war that we've lived for the last 10 years is intended to disrupt, divide, deceive. Sponsorship and spending on sport has been part of that proxy war. So whilst many of us may think, well, we've been watching a UEFA Champions League game sponsored by Gazprom, we've been watching Schalke sponsored by Gazprom, in reality, we've been watching a weapon that has been deployed.
Gazprom's most powerful lobbying weapon was Gerhard Schröder. In 2019, he fired the start gun at the Nord Stream race in Kiel. The sporting event itself seemed completely divorced from any political turmoil.
The motto of this regatta is Connecting Baltics, and we're bringing together sport, cultures, clubs and sailors from different countries. And in the end, that's precisely what Nord Stream is doing, making a big contribution to international understanding and intercultural coexistence.
The route of the long-distance regatta took sailors all the way to St. Petersburg, along the Baltic Sea pipeline.
My worst distraction, my rhythm and blues.
A PR gift for Schröder.
In my head for you.
And another stage for Gazprom.
Let's be honest, ladies and gentlemen. The world is plagued by a whole host of problems. So isn't it nice to have events like these, showing us that different ways of living are possible, peacefully, in friendship, and in a way that benefits us all?
Putting a sentimental spin on things, Schröder did a good job, and the partners were pleased.
If you have such a precious instrument, you have to protect it from all sides. Propaganda is one of the elements of protection.
To this day, Gazprom continues to flex its power, both publicly and on the sidelines. In the year 2007, Miller and his team began applying pressure on the next former Soviet republic to step out of line, Belarus.
From August 3rd at 10 a.m., gas supplies to Belarus will be cut by around 21 million cubic meters per day.
It's a classic Russian playbook. The debt you had yesterday, said that's due today, and there'll be a 300% price increase if you don't pay it, and if you don't pay it, we're going to cut off the supply. It's transparent.
Belarus buckled too. The pressure from Gazprom was just too great.
We're seeing genuine efforts on the part of Belarus to resolve the debt issue. So we've decided not to restrict supplies today. We expect all gas debts to be settled by Thursday next week.
All ex-Soviet republics got to feel the power of Gazprom at some point. The world watched while Russia turned one country after another into an example. December 2007, Vice Chancellor and Foreign Minister Frank-Walter Steinmeier was in Moscow to meet Putin and his chosen successor, Dmitry Medvedev. The men opened another BASF gas field.
Energy supplies from Russia cover almost 40% of German demand in the gas sector. And this is based on a robust and trusting energy partnership between German and Russian companies. This should remain in place in the future. So, getting access to the gas fields and not just being dependent on the pipelines was the right thing in principle. But how dependent am I making myself?
In an article, Steinmeier criticized Frank Umbach's view. The latter had warned against excessive dependence on Siberian gas in a new Cold War.
That led to a dispute with Mr. Steinmeier, he said. No, this isn't a Cold War. It's part of our Ostpolitik, so to speak. We can't return to a new East-West conflict. That's old thinking. We need new thinking. In fact, this amounts to wishful thinking, and ultimately, it's something akin to a collective denial of reality.
There is a school of foreign policy that asserts the deeper the economic relations are, the more harmonious the foreign policy relationships are. But it wasn't about a historical disagreement about the power of trade to change foreign policy. It was about this person and his policy and the risk that he posed.
It wasn't interdependence, all right, but it's the kind of interdependence that you have between wolves and sheep.
The United States has overstepped its national borders in every way. In the economic, political, cultural, and educational policies it imposes on other nations. Who's happy about this? No one feels safe as a result. I want to emphasize this. No one feels safe. At the time, I wasn't yet chairman of the conference. But I was sitting in the audience listening and noticed how the German-American audience reacted to this speech with astonishment, but without really taking it seriously.
It was the first time very publicly that Vladimir Putin said, my attempts at being a partner to the West or working with the West, that's over. Russia will now follow and pursue its interests.
Putin was still reeling from the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, where politicians were pushing for EU membership.
The Orange Revolution did have a big impact on him. That was his first major defeat in Ukraine.
The color revolutions were beginning in the post-Soviet space, and it was at that speech at the Munich Security Conference where he said that era is now over.
In 2008, Putin was invited to a special NATO summit, as he so often was in the preceding 6 years.
We view the appearance of a powerful military bloc on our borders as a direct threat to the security of our nation. The claim that this process is not directed against Russia will not suffice. National security isn't based on promises.
What he wanted from the United States certainly was a recognition that, the European Union and NATO would never expand anywhere near Russia's borders. When he didn't get that, then I think he reverted more to true form.
Germany stood by Putin.
NATO isn't directed against anyone, certainly not against Russia. Russia is a partner.
For the first time since 1992, Putin allowed Russian nuclear bombers to conduct training flights close to the U.S.
Vladimir Putin began long-range bomber flights in 2007, and then he began to demonstrate that there cannot be independent, sovereign countries around Russia.
Putin supported separatists in Georgia with Russian tanks and soldiers, the first European war of the 21st century.
2008 was just a greater warm-up act for what he would do in Ukraine.
The deaths in Georgia did not affect the business with Russian gas.
With the situation as it was then, I can't recall any government seriously talking about an energy boycott.
Meanwhile, in Moscow, Gazprom was throwing another party, marking 15 years as a public limited company.
Our energy exports, including those to faraway nations, help to ensure international energy security.
The same day, Gazprom threatened Ukraine and used its own media as a stage to do so.
We've already prepared an action plan for tomorrow in connection with restrictions to our gas supplies.
The message was received in Kyiv.
Nothing will change until Ukraine kneels before Russia.
Alexei Miller invited the head of Ukraine's gas company for talks. He publicly accused Ukraine of stealing Russian gas. The man wasn't allowed to defend himself. Meeting with Putin at the president's official residence outside Moscow, Miller reported back. His proposal: curtail gas supplies to Ukraine by the precise amount that the Ukrainians allegedly stole. Putin gave the green light, and the plan was implemented immediately.
Over 80% of Russia's gas exports to Europe go via pipelines which run through the Ukraine. And on this coldest day of winter, 3 of those have basically been shut down. Romania has a 75% reduction, and over here, Austria is 90% down.
If someone's cutting the gas off in the 21st century, you can certainly describe it as an act of war. I can't think of another phrase.
This situation is obviously very serious and needs to improve rapidly.
This whole Ukraine story back then, the cutting off of supplies, raised certain questions about the reliability of Gazprom as a supplier. I didn't like it. I also spoke to Alex Miller about it. He said, yes, it'll pass.
I was personally in the room of Mr. Miller when he was clearly telling our delegation, everything you want to discuss, you tell me, here is the phone, I call there, he tells me yes or no. If it is about Ukraine, Putin decides.
Putin waged the gas war with ruthlessness, dismissing all the arguments from Ukraine.
It doesn't matter who presents what. I could simply toss all these papers in the fire. What's important is this. No transit nation has the right to abuse its position and take European customers hostage in this way.
The Russians are brilliant propagandists, and Ukraine did not help itself in those days because the suspicion of corruption was quite high, and Ukraine was not always a sympathetic case. And so the Russians were able to leverage that to say, you poor Europeans are suffering because these irresponsible Ukrainians are not paying their bill.
Russia has actually been very successful at framing those disputes and blaming Ukraine's supposed theft of the gas. And I think that there's a lot of people in Germany especially who buy into that and agree that actually the problems with the Ukraine transit are more Ukrainian than they are Russian. And there's a lot of sympathy, I think, for the Russian point of view in Germany, not necessarily anywhere else, but I've seen it very much here.
The mistrust was directed at Ukraine and not Russia.
On behalf of the Ukrainian state, I would like to explain that Ukraine, despite all claims made by the Russian leadership, hasn't stolen a single cubic meter of Russian natural gas.
The Ukrainians put up a defense, but Germany wasn't really listening.
My take is that that particular view builds upon, perhaps in particular, German narrative vis-à-vis Ukraine, a narrative in which Ukraine is invisible, and if it is visible, it's only visible through stereotypes.
The EU eventually sent monitors to run checks on the gas flow. Putin continued to feign innocence.
That's why I'm asking you to take all the necessary documents with you, including the contracts. We've got nothing to hide. These aren't classified documents.
My country has strongly condemned Russia's actions in Georgia. We also are very troubled by using energy as a tool of intimidation.
On the propaganda front, Putin began to lose ground. On a visit to Gazprom HQ, he continued to blame Ukraine.
It may well be that the Ukrainian pipeline network is in such a state that it can't pump such quantities of gas. That's also quite possible. But then you have to be upfront about it.
Finally, Putin turned the gas tap back on.
This is Pavlov, senior dispatcher at Gazprom headquarters, asking you to restore the gas supply via the Zudsha gas metering station at 10 a.m. Moscow time.
Putin got concessions from the Ukrainian government that they would not try and push for NATO membership. He got the Black Sea Fleet, which was on a lease basis. He got the Ukrainians to extend that lease to 2017. It was very clear that he got those as part of the gas deal negotiations.
And Putin managed something else. He'd kept Germany sweet. Miller had made sure that gas supplies to Germany remained unaffected by the crisis.
Germany didn't suffer during the Ukraine gas crisis, not at all. On one occasion there was talk of maybe reducing the reliance a little, but nothing happened.
That was never a German problem. No one did that to the Germans. They did it to the others.
I heard, oh, Andrei, we are such a big gas market, and Russians would not mess with it.
The Kremlin has weaponized energy over the years in such a dramatic fashion, so many times, that it is astonishing that there had been no policy changes in Berlin or in Vienna or by other governments in Western Europe.
Germany did nothing to adapt its strategy. It wanted more and more Russian gas, as cheaply as possible.
We were grateful to have access to Russian gas and the gas fields. This was of long-term significance. I mean, let's not forget, the gas was really cheap. If I can make an analogy, buying Russian gas was like going to the discounter Aldi.
In early 2009, Chancellor Angela Merkel wrote to EU Commission President José Manuel Barroso outlining her arguments in favor of Nord Stream. Secure links were needed, an issue once again highlighted by the Ukraine crisis.
There could have been major obstacles to this, as indeed there were at times. That's why progress was so slow, and that's why political support was crucial in Europe.
Meanwhile, Gazprom continued its EU charm offensive. New pipeline sections were opened with great fanfare. At one such event, German EU Energy Commissioner Günther Oettinger gave the pipeline his blessing.
Time and again, we've actually had to intervene and provide support, above all politically in Brussels. That's true. Gazprom didn't do the lobbying work on its own. I mean, it's just too far away. You need European partners. We lobbied together, of course. Today, if you want to build a large wind park in the North Sea, you'll come up against similar issues. Some are quick to sort out, others take longer.
Late 2010, Berlin. Putin pokes fun at the EU and the sluggish progress of the pipeline project.
Vladimir Putin.
One thing I'll never understand, what do you actually plan to heat with? You don't want our gas or our nuclear energy. Do you plan to heat with wood? Even for that, you'll have to go to Siberia.
From his perspective, this was certainly a hint. You need me more than I need you. In this respect, yes, we can say there were sufficient indications that should probably have been taken more seriously, and yes, that perhaps weren't taken as seriously as they should have been.
A dinner date later that same day in Berlin. Putin and Vanik met with the ex-chancellor at a posh restaurant owned by Matthias Vanik's son.
I don't know how many French presidents, how many British prime ministers have been photographed with Putin, probably also in Parisian restaurants. I don't know. This debate to say in hindsight, yes, one could have done this or that, and these photographs show this special closeness. Everyone in Europe was happy that the Germans were ensuring a high level of energy security.
the governments in Sweden and in Finland were strongly against the pipeline due to environmental problems and also due to geopolitical problems. The Swedish military intelligence came out with a statement or warning saying that this pipeline could be used to spy on Sweden. Sweden used to get visits from Russian submarines. They were very concerned about that could happen again and that they could use Nord Stream, some of the platforms and the pipeline to actually spy on Sweden.
Ex-Chancellor Schröder was once again deployed for Gazprom. He contacted a man who was once Prime Minister of Sweden.
Jan Persson and Gerhard Schröder, they are old buddies. He was one of the first top-level politicians to talk about the climate crisis and hardly against lobbyism. In 2007, he received a phone call and Schröder invited him for lunch. And after the lunch date, Jan Persson went public and told that he has now signed as a consultant at the Public Affairs Bureau in Sweden, linked up to E.ON, the German energy giant, and one of the shareholders of Nord Stream.
Gazprom also saw the need for action in Finland. Schröder homed in on a senior Finnish politician.
They really needed a person to speak in their favor, a high-level person, and they found Paavo Lipponen.
Lipponen led the Social Democrats in Finland, serving as Prime Minister for 8 years.
Lipponen was invited to Berlin. He was received by Schröder and Mattias Warnig, the former Stasi captain.
Lipponen started working as a paid lobbyist for Nord Stream.
He was a key person. By meeting politicians in Finland to convince them that this is a very good thing for Finland and for Scandinavia and for whole Europe, we will secure the gas supply. So that was his task, to convince the Finnish government about that and the population. And he succeeded.
Now, Vladimir Putin was able to visit the pipeline construction site in the Gulf of Finland and show the world he was advancing towards Europe.
It was very, very clever from the Russian side to recruit all the former top-level politicians and to fill their pockets.
Were there any consequences?
No way. They are living in the best way today.
The pipeline project became unstoppable. In September 2011, Putin and Schröder symbolically turned on the gas. Germany had finally thrown its weight behind gas in response to a catastrophe that had just befallen Japan.
The Fukushima disaster terrified not only Japanese but also European politicians into fear of the security of nuclear power.
We will completely phase out nuclear energy by the end of 2022.
At the time, we made it clear that we needed to invest more in coal and especially in gas. This configuration of the energy transition was entirely focused on gas.
That created an enormous vulnerability for Germany, and it only accelerated the dependence on Russian gas.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Angela Merkel, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany.
Nord Stream will play its part in ensuring that Europe also has a secure gas supply in the future.
Merkel, along with the French and Dutch prime ministers, were also invited to turn on the tap. Gas then flowed through Nord Stream 1 to Western Europe, with less and less being channeled through Poland and Ukraine.
I would challenge you to find one example of how any of these pipelines or any of these energy deals with Russia made Russia more open, more democratic. It's never happened, and it was never going to happen, and I think that German leaders knew this and went along with it anyways.
Actually, I also think they knew what they were doing, because I don't think, you see, it was naivete. It was greed.
This fundamental attitude didn't change in the years that followed. German politicians went on pilgrimages to Russia. In 2019, the state premier of Saxony Michael Kretschmer, concluded a new gas contract. And lobbyist Schröder defended the next Russian pipeline. He left no doubt as to who the opponents were.
Danish politics has been jeopardizing a timely conclusion for months. Whereas construction is already underway in Russia, Sweden, Finland, and Germany, Danish approval is still pending. And that's because of political pressure from the US and, of course, Ukraine.
Corruption is a strategic tool of the Kremlin. In many ways, it's how Russia's system works. In many ways, they're exporting how it works inside Russia. And I think they were surprised how easily it was imported into the West. A board seat, a very lucrative contract. When you consider what is at stake, a nation's energy security, a nation's national security, it's very cheaply purchased.
You have the former econ minister of Austria being a senior advisor for Nord Stream 2 AG. You have former foreign minister of Austria, Karen Kneißl, with whom Putin was invited to and she danced with at her wedding.
Dear bride and groom, I congratulate you with all my heart on your marriage and the formation of a new family.
You have former French Prime Minister François Fillon, nominated to not one, but two Russian state-owned oil and gas trading firms. And the list goes on and on.
Putin never took his eye off one nation, Ukraine. Surya Jayanti worked at the US Embassy in Kyiv and experienced Russian influence at first hand.
A fair amount of the corruption in Ukraine is Russia as a malign actor and a malign influence. For example, in the gas sector.
And Ukraine's main protagonist was Dmitry Firtash. The billionaire lives in exile in Vienna. He made his money in the gas business partly because Gazprom offered him special conditions.
Dmitry Firtash is one of the oligarchs of Ukraine. He has his fingers in every single cookie jar. He has media holdings. He has energy holdings. He became rich, among other things, by stealing from the Ukrainian gas sector and by siphoning off very large portions of the gas.
Gazprom let him get away with it. Firtash has always denied any wrongdoing. US authorities want his extradition from Austria.
Dmitry Firtash has been indicted by the US government for bribery schemes. He has extremely strong connections to Russian organized crime and to Putin.
Aren't you afraid?
If you want to lick honey, don't be afraid of bees.
Firtash had founded a company with Russian partners.
Gazprom had over 160 subsidiary companies. Money could move around, change hands, and you'd never be the wiser as to where it went. In my estimation, a lot of those companies existed so that they could take money off the books and buy politicians.
And we all knew who was behind. It was established to give corrupt money to politicians.
So they used the revenue from the gas to basically corrupt Ukraine and take money themselves.
Yes. That's my assessment.
In the early 2000s and even beyond that, the way that much of the gas was imported into Ukraine and then re-exported to Europe was through a very opaque company called Rosukrenergo, which had Russian and Ukrainian business people involved in it.
Firtash supported the pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych. After winning the 2010 election, he steered Ukraine towards Moscow.
These people had political influence in Ukraine, and some of them were clearly agents of Russia.
It was very clear that Russia was using its money from Gazprom to influence Ukrainian politicians.
And I long thought that just like the trade in gas corrupted Ukrainian politics, so it would corrupt German politics.
Merkel did not back away from Putin in Russia.
I think that's right. Europe and Russia are strategic partners that have certainly not yet exhausted their potential for cooperation.
Changing the constitution allowed Putin a third term.
We won after an open and honest fight.
On the day of Putin's inauguration, tens of thousands of people protested in Moscow, denouncing the president as corrupt. He ordered the brutal suppression of the protest.
The West was telling itself its own stories. We didn't want to change our business, our behavior, our agenda. And Mr. Putin kept telling us, I'm going to disrupt you until you take my interests seriously.
More and more Russian money was being plowed into the destabilization of Ukraine. In 2013, the nation found itself in a dangerous crisis when President Yanukovych had to decide on a rapprochement with the EU.
Yanukovych attended a special summit of the European Union, and he told us the other side is offering more. And the European heads of state said to him, that's our limit, you won't get any more. That prompted him to reply, then I won't sign the association agreement. That was what Putin wanted, and the result was Maidan.
It was the spark that triggered an explosion. Yanukovych was forced into Russian exile.
In August 2015, I started at the U.S. Department of State as European Energy Security Advisor. I took over the job about a year after Russia illegally invaded eastern Ukraine, the Donbass region, and purportedly annexed Crimea. The idea at the time was Nord Stream 2 had been shelved, right? The idea that you would still build up this dependence on Russian energy was thought of as crazy. But less than a year later, Nord Stream 2 was back, and the ghost of Putin's pipeline was once again haunting Europe.
The contract for the construction of Nord Stream 2 was signed in September 2015.
I don't see any strategic trap there. I mean, the current situation is very much defined by the war with Ukraine, which is bad, really bad, and actually can't be justified. But I think it's an exaggeration to say that we've fallen into a strategic trap here.
Shortly before the annexation of Crimea, Miller visited Berlin. Once again, he blamed Ukraine.
Yes, Ukraine is in deep political crisis, but the gas still has to be paid for.
And Miller had another surprise up his sleeve.
Even I didn't think that Germany would be so naive as to sell Gazprom its storage capacity.
A BASF subsidiary agreed to this trade in 2012.
At that time, everything needed to be authorized. The state could have said, no, we don't want that. We want the storage facilities for ourselves. But that didn't happen. On the contrary, because we needed even more gas.
Economics Minister Gabriel approved the sale in 2015.
We received an increased share in production facilities. We continued to expand and acquired more gas fields. That was the goal.
It was also full steam ahead for Nord Stream 2, in accordance with the wishes of Chancellor Merkel and her deputy Scholz.
I clearly, on a couple of occasions, saw the data which was prepared by Gazprom.
Inside German ministries?
Yes. And those people were top-ranked people in the German Ministry of Economy.
That would be minister and the state secretaries?
Yes.
They would?
Very high.
The propaganda machine had cut deep into the system.
Russia was a reliable energy supplier even in the Cold War.
This is a purely economic, a purely commercial project.
This is a private sector project that...
I have German interests to represent in particular. This project isn't directed against any of our partners.
I'm worried about Ukraine, because by relocating gas transit routes, Putin is paving the way for a large-scale military operation that will ultimately lead to the appearance of Russian tanks on the eastern borders of Poland, Hungary, Slovakia and Romania.
Forgive me for interrupting you, but do you really believe that's a feasible scenario?
Why did you say that?
Because it is true. Gazprom is part of the Russian army. It's one of their weapons.
Shortly before Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 was completed.
Today, the second Nord Stream 2 pipeline must also be filled with gas.
7 months after the initial attack on Ukraine, the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were sabotaged. One pipe remained operable.
It appears that one of the Nord Stream 2 pipelines is still intact. In short, the ball is now in the EU's court. Is the will there? Well, then they should turn on the tap.